My name is Emma, and I haven't spoken a single word in my 19 years of life. Born mute, I learned early that the world moves differently when you can't use your voice the way others do. But what I discovered about myself would change everything I thought I knew about communication, stamily, and the hidden truths that surround us every day. You see, while I couldn't speak to humans, I found something far more extraordinary. I could communicate with animals. And let me tell you, they had secrets to share that would turn my entire world upside down. What would you do if you discovered that the creatures around you were trying to warn you about dangers you never saw coming? Growing up in suburban Ohio, I lived with my mother Sarah and my stepfather Rick, who married my mom when I was 12. Rick always seemed like the perfect stepfather on the surface. He worked construction, brought flowers home for mom, and never raised his voice. But something about him always felt off to me. Though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, my mother, desperate for stability after my father left when I was 5, seemed genuinely happy with Rick. She'd light up when he walked through the door, and I wanted so badly to share her joy. But there was this nagging feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. My inability to speak meant I communicated through writing, sign language, and gestures, but somehow I always felt like I was missing crucial conversations happening around me. The first time I realized I could communicate with animals, I was 14 and sitting in our backyard with our golden retriever, Max. I was having one of those particularly frustrating days where I felt completely invisible, when suddenly I heard a voice in my head saying, "You're sad today, Emma." I looked around, confused, then realized the voice was coming from Max. His tail wagged as he looked directly into my eyes, and I heard him again. "I can feel your sadness. You don't have to be alone." At first, I thought I was losing my mind. I mean, dogs don't talk, right? But over the next few weeks, I began experimenting. I would focus my thoughts toward Max, and he would respond. Not with barks, but with clear thoughts that formed words in my mind. It was like discovering a secret language that no one else knew existed. Soon I realized my ability wasn't limited to Max. The neighborhood cats would share gossip about which houses had the best food scraps. The birds told me about weather patterns days in advance. Even the squirrels had opinions about the best hiding spots for nuts and the safest routes through the trees. It was like having access to an entirely different world that existed parallel to the human one. The animals were incredibly intelligent and observant, noticing details about human behavior that people themselves missed. They watched everything with curious eyes and sharp minds. Mrs. Peterson's cat, Whiskers, told me about her owner's secret boyfriend who visited while her husband was at work. The mailman's dog, Buddy, shared stories about which houses received suspicious packages. It was fascinating and sometimes overwhelming to suddenly have access to so much information that humans were completely unaware of. When I turned 16, Max started acting differently around Rick. He would growl low in his throat whenever my stepfather entered the room, and his thoughts became more urgent when he communicated with me. "Something's wrong with him, Emma," Max would tell me repeatedly. "He smells wrong. Danger smell." I tried to understand what Max meant, but Rick continued to be the same seemingly pleasant man he'd always been. He still brought Mom flowers, still helped with household repairs, still smiled and waved at neighbors. But Max's warnings became more specific. "He talks to someone when you're not here," Max informed me one afternoon. "Angry talking, starey words. He says bad things about you and your mom." I started paying closer attention to Rick's behavior, looking for signs of what Max was sensing. The more I observed, the more I began to notice subtle things I'd missed before. It wasn't just Max anymore. Every animal in our neighborhood began warning me about Rick. Mrs. Johnson's parrot, Charlie, who could see directly into our kitchen window from his perch, told me disturbing things. "The man with the rough hands makes mean phone calls," Charlie shared. He says words about making people disappear. He talks about money and being angry. The stray cats that hung around our garbage cans were even more specific. We see him digging at night. One orange tabby informed me. Behind the shed, deep holes, then filling them back up. Strange smells come from the dirt. I felt my blood run cold. What could Rick possibly be burying behind our shed? Why was he making phone calls about making people disappear? The animals' consistent warnings were making me increasingly anxious, but I had no proof. And how could I explain to my mother that the family pets were telling me disturbing secrets? I decided I needed evidence before approaching my mother with such serious accusations. Using my phone, I began recording Rick when he thought no one was home. The animals had taught me his patterns. Charlie told me exactly when Rick made his suspicious phone calls, and Max informed me when Rick went out to the backyard at night. One evening, hiding behind the garden shed with my phone, I finally captured what the animals had been trying to tell me. Rick was on the phone with someone, speaking in hushed but angry tones about getting rid of problems and making sure certain people couldn't cause trouble anymore. He mentioned specific names, people I later discovered were former coworkers who had filed complaints against him for workplace harassment. The conversation was chilling, and I realized the animals had been trying to protect not just me and my mother, but other people as well. The next part of my investigation required more courage than I thought I possessed. Following the cat's directions, I waited until Rick left for work and my mother went grocery shopping. Armed with a small shovel, I went to the area behind the shed where the cat said Rick had been digging. The ground was softer there, recently disturbed despite Rick's attempts to make it look natural. What I found buried shallow beneath the surface made my hands shake. Several cell phones, jewelry, and personal items that clearly belonged to different people. There was a woman's purse with identification for someone named Linda Morrison, a man's wallet belonging to James Chen, and other personal effects that had no business being buried in our backyard. I realized Rick wasn't just making threats. He had actually hurt people, and the evidence was literally in our own backyard. The animals had been trying to save lives by warning me. I knew I had to act quickly, but I also knew that confronting Rick directly would be dangerous. The animals had made it clear that he was unpredictable and potentially violent. Max began staying closer to me, positioning himself between me and Rick whenever possible. "He knows something's different," Max warned me. "His angry smell is getting stronger. He's watching you more." I realized Rick had begun to suspect that I knew something. He would stare at me during dinner with a calculating look that made my skin crawl. When my mother wasn't looking, his friendly facade would slip, and I could see something cold and predatory in his eyes. The animals confirmed my fears. They could sense his increasing agitation and the danger that was building. I needed to find a way to expose Rick without putting myself or my mother in immediate danger. But how do you explain to police that animals told you where to find buried evidence? Working with my animal allies, I developed a plan that would expose Rick while keeping us safe. Charlie the parrot was crucial. His owner, Mrs. Johnson, was a retired police dispatcher who still had connections with local law enforcement. Through Charlie, I learned Mrs. Johnson's routine and found a way to get the evidence to her indirectly. I created an anonymous tip letter with photos of the buried items and Rick's recorded phone conversations. Then asked the neighborhood cats to help me deliver it to Mrs. Johnson's mailbox when no one was watching. The letter included detailed information about where to find the evidence and suggested they investigate Rick's background more thoroughly. I signed it simply as a concerned neighbor who can't speak but has seen too much. Within days, Mrs. Johnson had contacted her former colleagues, and an investigation was quietly begun. The police investigation moved faster than I had expected. The animals kept me informed of every development. They watched as unmarked cars drove by our house, as officers in civilian clothes knocked on neighbors' doors asking questions, and as Rick became increasingly paranoid and agitated. Max told me Rick had been pacing the house at night, making more angry phone calls, and even talking to himself in ways that suggested he knew his time was running out. "He's getting ready to run," Max warned me one morning. "Packing things, hiding papers. He's planning to leave soon." I realized that if Rick disappeared, he might never face justice for what he'd done to those people whose belongings were buried in our yard. The animals and I needed to make sure the police had everything they needed before Rick had a chance to escape. On a rainy Thursday evening, the animals coordinated one final intelligence-gathering mission. While Rick was in the shower, Max distracted my mother by pretending to be sick, drawing her attention to the living room. Meanwhile, Charlie guided me to Rick's hiding spot, a loose floorboard in the basement that the mice had discovered weeks earlier. Hidden beneath the board, I found Rick's insurance policy, detailed records of every crime he'd committed, including photos, addresses, and what appeared to be trophies from his victims. It was like discovering a serial killer's collection, and I realized Rick was far more dangerous than even the animals had initially sensed. With shaking hands, I photographed everything with my phone, making sure to capture every detail before carefully replacing everything exactly as I'd found it. This evidence would be the final nail in Rick's coffin. 2 days later, our house was surrounded by police cars at dawn. I watched from my bedroom window as officers approached our front door with a warrant. Rick tried to maintain his innocent act, but the evidence was overwhelming. As they led him away in handcuffs, he looked directly up at my bedroom window with pure hatred in his eyes. He knew, somehow, that I was responsible for his downfall. My mother was devastated and confused, unable to understand how the man she trusted had been hiding such darkness. But as the police explained what they'd found and what Rick had done to those missing people, she began to realize how close we'd come to becoming victims ourselves. The animals had literally saved our lives by trusting me with their observations and warnings. In the weeks following Rick's arrest, my mother and I began the difficult process of healing and rebuilding our sense of safety. The police investigation revealed that Rick had been involved in the disappearances of 5 people over the past 3 years. Former co-workers, neighbors from previous cities, and others who had somehow crossed him or threatened to expose his various illegal activities. My mother struggled with guilt, wondering how she could have been so blind to Rick's true nature. But I knew the truth. Rick had been exceptionally good at hiding his darkness from humans. It was only the animals, with their heightened senses and different perspective, who could detect the danger he represented. They had been trying to protect us all along, and I was grateful beyond words that I had the ability to hear their warnings. The trial became a media sensation, particularly when it was revealed that the anonymous tips had come from someone who claimed to communicate with animals. While I never publicly admitted to being the source, the experience taught me something profound about the nature of communication and finding your voice. I may never be able to speak in the traditional sense, but I had found a way to make my voice heard when it mattered most. Through my connection with the animals, I had literally saved lives and brought a dangerous criminal to justice. My mother began learning sign language more seriously, and we developed deeper ways of communicating that went beyond words. She also developed a new appreciation for Max and the other neighborhood animals, understanding now that they possessed wisdom and awareness that humans often overlooked. Word of my unique ability eventually reached Dr. Sarah Chen, a researcher at the local university who specialized in animal behavior and communication. She approached my mother and me about participating in some informal studies, not as a test subject, but as a collaborator who might help bridge the gap between human and animal understanding. Through Dr. Chen, I began working with local animal shelters, helping to understand the needs and histories of rescued animals who couldn't communicate their trauma or preferences to human caretakers. It was incredibly fulfilling work that gave my unusual gift a positive purpose. Many animals who had been considered difficult or unadoptable were simply dealing with trauma or specific fears that they could communicate to me, but not to their human caregivers. My work with the animal shelters led to partnerships with veterinarians, wildlife rehabilitators, and even law enforcement canine units. While I was always careful about how I shared information, claiming intuition or careful observation rather than direct communication, I was able to help in ways that surprised everyone involved. Dogs could tell me about injuries or pain they couldn't express otherwise. Cats revealed their preferences for homes and families. Wild animals shared information about environmental changes or threats to their habitats. Slowly, I built a reputation as someone who had an unusually deep understanding of animal behavior. The secret I shared with the animals became a bridge between two worlds, helping humans better understand and care for the creatures who shared their lives. Through my experiences, I learned that animals are constantly observing and processing information about the human world, but they have no way to share their insights with the people who could benefit from their knowledge. They see patterns, notice changes, and detect dangers that humans miss because we're often too busy or distracted to pay attention to the subtle signs around us. My ability to communicate with them revealed just how much wisdom and awareness exists in the animal kingdom. Wisdom that could help solve problems, prevent tragedies, and build stronger communities if only humans knew how to access it. The animals don't see the world the way we do. They see it more clearly in many ways, without the biases and assumptions that cloud human judgment. Rick was eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for multiple counts of murder and conspiracy. During the trial, more evidence emerged about his involvement in other disappearances across different states where he had lived and worked. The families of his victims were finally able to have closure and lay their loved ones to rest. I attended the sentencing with my mother, and while I felt satisfaction that justice had been served, I was most grateful for the lesson about trust and intuition. The animals had tried to warn me long before I had any concrete evidence of Rick's crimes. They had trusted me with information that could have saved lives even sooner if I had acted on their warnings earlier. It taught me to trust not just what I could see and prove, but what I could sense and feel. News of Rick's conviction and the unusual circumstances surrounding his exposure had unexpected consequences in our community. People began paying more attention to their pets' behavior, noticing when animals seemed distressed or agitated around certain people or situations. Several other cases of abuse and neglect were discovered when pet owners started taking their animals' reactions more seriously. Mrs. Peterson finally left her cheating husband after her cat Whiskers. Behavior made her investigate more carefully. A neighbor realized their teenage son was struggling with drug addiction when the family dog began acting anxious and protective around him. The animals had always been trying to communicate important information. People just needed to learn how to listen and observe more carefully. The experience with Rick fundamentally changed how I viewed my disability and my unique gift. For years, I had felt frustrated and isolated by my inability to speak, seeing it only as a limitation that separated me from others. But I came to understand that my difference had actually given me access to a form of communication that was potentially more valuable than traditional speech. The animals trusted me because I was quiet and observant, because I listened with my whole being rather than just waiting for my turn to talk. My silence had taught me to pay attention to nonverbal communication, body language, and subtle environmental cues that most people missed. What I had always seen as my greatest weakness had actually been preparing me for my greatest strength. As word spread about my work with animals, I began connecting with other people who had unique relationships with the natural world. I met a deaf woman who worked as a wildlife photographer and claimed she could sense animal emotions through vibrations and visual cues. There was a man with autism who had an extraordinary ability to predict animal behavior and had prevented several dangerous situations at the local zoo. A blind veterinarian who could diagnose certain conditions through touch and sound that other doctors missed. I realized I wasn't alone in having abilities that seemed unusual, but were actually just different ways of processing and understanding the world. We formed an informal network of people who saw the world through non-traditional lenses, supporting each other and sharing our unique perspectives. Today, 5 years after Rick's arrest, I work full-time as an animal behavior consultant. I help families understand their pets, assist shelters in matching animals with appropriate homes, and work with researchers who are studying animal intelligence and communication. While I'm still careful about revealing the true extent of my abilities, I found ways to share the wisdom the animals offer without seeming completely unbelievable to skeptical humans. My mother has become one of my biggest advocates, often telling people that I have an intuitive gift that helps me understand animals in ways that surprise everyone. She's proud of how I've turned my differences into strengths, and our relationship has grown deeper and more trusting since we survived the ordeal with Rick together. What I've learned is that communication comes in many forms, and the most important conversations often happen without words at all. The animals taught me that being truly heard is about more than making sound. It's about being understood, believed, and acted upon when sharing something important. My stepfather Rick was able to fool humans with his words and his carefully constructed facade, but he couldn't fool the animals, who sensed the darkness beneath his surface. They saw through his lies because they were listening with different senses, paying attention to signals that humans ignore. In a world where people can manipulate language to hide their true intentions, there's something pure and honest about the way animals communicate. They can't lie or pretend to be something they're not. The animals continue to teach me every day about patience, observation, loyalty, and unconditional love. They've shown me that every creature has value and intelligence, even if it doesn't match human standards or expectations. A sparrow's knowledge of weather patterns is just as valid as a meteorologist's forecast. A dog's assessment of a person's character is often more accurate than a background check. The collective wisdom of the animal kingdom represents millions of years of evolution and survival instinct that humans have only recently begun to appreciate and respect. They've taught me that being different isn't a limitation. It's often a superpower that allows you to see and do things that others can't. Looking forward, I hope to continue building bridges between the human and animal worlds. There's so much we could learn from each other if we just took the time to listen and observe more carefully. I dream of a future where people routinely consult with animals about environmental decisions, where pets are recognized as early warning systems for family problems, and where the wisdom of wild creatures is valued in conservation efforts. My inability to speak has taught me that the most important communication happens when we listen more than we talk, when we observe more than we assume, and when we trust our instincts even when we can't explain them logically. The animals gave me a voice when I thought I had none, and now I want to help give them a voice in return. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Pay attention to the animals in your life. They're constantly trying to communicate with you through their behavior, their body language, and their responses to different people and situations. Trust your pets when they seem uncomfortable around certain people. Notice when they're trying to get your attention or warn you about something. The animal kingdom is full of wisdom and awareness that could help protect and guide us if we just learned how to listen. You don't need my specific ability to benefit from their insights. You just need to be observant, patient, and open to the idea that intelligence comes in many different forms. My name is Emma, and while I may never speak with my voice, I've learned to communicate in ways I never imagined possible. The animals saved my life and my mother's life by trusting me with their observations and warnings. They taught me that being different isn't something to hide or overcome. It's something to embrace and use for good. Every day, I'm grateful for the gift that allows me to hear their voices and share their wisdom with the world. In a society that often values talking over listening, I found strength in silence and discovered that sometimes the most important conversations happen without any words at all. What would you do if you discovered you could communicate with animals? Would you trust their warnings about the people around you? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed Emma's incredible story, please hit that subscribe button. I share amazing true stories like this one every single day. Let me know in the comments which type of story you'd like to see next. If one story idea gets 50 comments, that will be the topic of my next video. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss these incredible journeys of courage, survival, and discovering hidden strengths we never knew we had.